On the 14th of June 2017, police in Paris responded to a call regarding two missing teenagers. The boys, aged 16 and 17, had ventured into the catacombs, an unlit, winding network of tunnels that run underneath the capital city of France. Some are flooded. Many are lined with millions of human bones. And the whole network of tunnels, crypts, crawl spaces and caves stretches on for at least 250 kilometers, or 150 miles. The boys had been lost in this labyrinth for 2 days already. It was now a race against time to ensure that they didn't join the 6 million dead already interred beneath the streets of Paris. Paris is currently a city of more than 2 million people, with a history that stretches back well over 1,000 years. As with any large city that has existed for so long, at some point it had a problem to overcome. What should be done with its dead? For many years, Parisians who passed away in the city were buried in one of a number of cemeteries. One of the most well-known was the Holy Innocents Cemetery, which was situated in what is now the very centre of the city. In the 1100s, people were buried there in individual graves, but as the cemetery started to run short of space, it became the norm to inter the dead in mass graves, huge pits that could hold as many as 1,500 corpses each. By the 1400s, however, there was no space even for these mass graves in the Holy Innocents Cemetery. Workers constructed charnel houses around the perimeter of the burial ground. The bones of the long dead would be excavated from their graves and stacked within these buildings to free up space in the cemetery for new burials. As the years went on and the city grew, conditions within this and other cemeteries became steadily worse and worse. There were more dead than ever to bury, and less space to do so in. Churches, which charged fees for burials within their attached cemeteries, resisted all attempts to establish new burial grounds outside the city, and so the bodies continued to pile up in ever-worsening conditions. By the early 1700s, the Holy Innocents Cemetery had resorted to burying the dead in an above-ground mound. Conditions were extremely unsanitary, with a strong smell of decomposition surrounding the graveyard. In 1780, a particularly rainy spring caused several partially decomposed bodies to emerge from their graves. Several graves also collapsed through a wall into the basement of an adjoining property. The overcrowding of Parisian cemeteries had reached a crisis point. Something needed to be done. In 1786, a solution was finally found. Paris had been built from the material that was available nearby, Lutetia limestone. This stone, which is unique to the area around Paris, was mined extensively during the city's formation, leaving behind a massive network of crisscrossing and intersecting mines. These mines had originally been outside the city limits, but as the capital expanded, Paris had grown to cover them. Now, it was suggested, these tunnels could be used as a repository for the city's dead. The idea was put into action in 1785. Day after day, hundreds of bodies were disinterred from the city's crowded cemeteries and carried in a solemn procession to a property that had become the designated entry point for the city's new subterranean graveyard. Due to the conditions in which they had been stored, many bodies had mummified rather than fully decomposing. Corpse wax was collected from these bodies and made into soaps and candles, while grave markers and other important items from the graveyard were saved in an above-ground museum, open to the public. Over the course of several years, the city's cemeteries were emptied, and the problem of what to do with Paris's dead was finally resolved. In 1793, Philibert Aspert, a doorkeeper at the Val-de-Grâce Hospital, ventured into the catacombs. At some point during his exploration, he broke or lost his lantern, leaving him in pitch blackness. He blundered on, unable to find his way out before eventually succumbing to the cold. his body wasn't found until more than a decade later, in 1804, by which time he had decomposed and could be identified only by his personal effects. Philibert Aspiet, then, became the very first person to have died as a result of becoming lost in the Paris catacombs. In the 1810s, the catacombs were renovated extensively by the director of the Paris Mine Inspection Service. Parts were walled off, and arches and solemn inscriptions were added to others. Bones, which had originally just been piled in underground tunnels, were stacked in artful patterns and graceful structures, creating an environment that could ultimately be opened to paying visitors. The site was popular at once, both with those who wished to pay their respects to the dead and with tourists visiting the city from overseas. Throughout the 1800s, the catacombs were intermittently open to visitors and were generally popular when they were. This trend continued into the 1900s. At the same time, many Parisians enjoyed exploring not only the parts of the catacombs that had been furnished for the purposes of tourism, but also venturing into the rest of the extensive network of tunnels by any means they could find. As well as the excitement of exploring, the catacombs were also a place to gather. Graffiti artists made temporary installations and residents gathered for informal meetings and parties. Beneath the streets of the city, surrounded by the bones of 6 million of their dead ancestors, they could listen to music, watch films, and partake in substances that weren't permitted in the world above. Over time, a culture developed around the exploration of the catacombs. By the 2000s, a defined area was open to paying visitors year-round. It was, and is, managed alongside the city's other major museums and generates significant revenue. But beyond this, many people go to great lengths to find their way into other parts of the catacombs where visitors are not so readily welcomed. Many visitors are there simply to explore a subterranean world, although some use the space to make art, meet with friends, and even enjoy raucous parties. Recreational drug use is common, but more serious criminal activity is surprisingly rare. Most regular explorers of the catacombs are self-policing. They try to ensure that they, and all visitors, behave respectfully, do not damage the tunnels, and do not engage in behavior that might cause authorities to act to seal off the catacombs, even going so far as to politely but firmly escort out visitors who they see as unprepared or likely to get lost or injured. Despite this subterranean culture, people do occasionally get lost in the sprawling network of tunnels. It is possible to wander for multiple days without finding an easy exit, and should an explorer lose their light source, they may be unable to find their way out even if only a few steps away from a route up to the surface. There are a number of hazards for those lost in the catacombs, from stagnant water to cold temperatures, dehydration, exhaustion, and the possibility of trips, falls, and other injuries. When a group is lost in the underground tunnels, it is imperative to find them as quickly as possible. One close call took place in 2017. On the 14th of June, police responded to a report of 2 teenagers who had entered the catacombs and not yet re-emerged. Their parents raised the alarm when they had not heard from their children after 48 hours. Firefighters began a search of the extensive tunnel network and were soon joined by a canine team and search and rescue specialists. Nearly 12 hours after the search began, faint cries for help were heard, and minutes later the rescuers located the 2 boys. They were exhausted and scared, stranded in complete darkness. They had entered with a map of the catacombs, but quickly become disoriented. The cell phones they were relying on for light died one after the other, and they had been unable even to use the last few % of their batteries to call for help, as there was no reception 2 stories underground. Without light, the boys had been entirely unable to navigate. They had stopped moving in a gallery and waited in pitch blackness for hours, hoping to hear another explorer moving in the dark. For hours they heard nothing and saw nothing, until finally they were rescued. As they were taken back up to the surface, they admitted that it was not the first time that they had ventured down into the catacombs, but it might well be their last. The boys were reunited with their families, treated for hypothermia, and then released from hospital. They had survived a total of 72 hours lost underground. Though they were only minutes away from an exit when they were found, if they had not been found, they might never have left the catacombs alive. Creepy stories and reports of strange goings-on in the catacombs abound, and the tunnels are not without dangers. Each year, a small number of people are injured or taken ill in the course of exploring them. And each year, a small number of crimes do take place in this shadowy underworld. But since the late 1700s, however creepy and extensive they may be, there is no record of anyone becoming lost forever within the galleries and tunnels of the Paris catacombs.